What about in life? Just now you mentioned about the work, but what about in life? How do you keep the balance at home with Bill?
Sure. Well, I mean, we both, of course, again, we love each other, right? And we have a lot of respect for each other. We're raising 3 kids. So is it easy every single day? No. But, you know, for the most part, we agree on things. Sure, there are sometimes tensions around time, right? Time is our scarcest resource. So if I feel Bill is traveling too much, or he feels like maybe I'm not taking the right number of meetings, or I'm traveling too much, we can disagree about that. But we always try to step back and look at our calendar as a whole, because it helps us drive our family forward in our goals and what we want to do.
It is said that Bill talked a lot about science during your dating time. Is that true?
Sure. Bill loves science, but I like to listen. And we both read a lot, and sometimes on vacations quite often we'll be reading different books, but then every few chapters we'll explain it to the other person. And for me, one of the things I love is that Bill has always said that if you are really learning something deeply, you don't know if you know it until you can teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
And Bill's a really good teacher, so I learn a lot of science by what Bill reads and explains to me, and he learns a lot about the world through what I read, but also the trips I take where I'm out in a remote rural area and I come back and tell him this is what I've heard from women, and he listens very deeply as well.
So what interests you most? What kind of subject? Like the women's subject? Or?
For reading,
Yeah,
or
for
for my
reading.
work? Oh, for reading, I love to read cultural fiction because I feel like I really learn deeply about a place if you're reading the fiction of that place. So quite often if I'm, say for instance, in India, I'll be reading cultural fiction about India, or cultural fiction if I'm in Africa.
How does those books, both what you read and what Bill's read, help you to build a foundation?
Oh, I think it helps us have huge perspective, because any of these scientific innovations that we are trying to move and push forward for the world, you have to remember you can have the very best science tool, but if a woman won't accept putting those polio drops in her child's mouth, or that vaccine in her child's arm or in her arm, that best science is going to sit on the shelf. And so understanding the cultural perspective and how do you work with civil society and with parents in a culture so that they choose to take these tools up, that's vitally important. And so we both come at it from these 2 angles and merge them together, and I think that helps benefit the work and move it forward.
Now here you are in China, and we all very welcome you here. What's your biggest challenge to do your foundation work here?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a challenge. I would say the biggest thing about working in China is making sure that we're supporting China's goals. So President Xi Jinping has this huge goal for poverty alleviation. He talks very passionately about it. He did with Bill and me when he was in Seattle in 2015. And we want to support that work, and in addition take those lessons and have China export those lessons to around the world. So everything that China has learned about malaria eradication, where there used to be 60 million cases a year of malaria in China, now there's a few thousand, that amazing research and development, and also the tactics of how you do a real malaria elimination, we want to make sure those lessons are actually moved to China, or moved to Africa. Or the amazing things that China has done in agriculture to feed, China has 10% of the arable land in the world, and yet they feed 25% of the world's population. So how do you take those lessons of agriculture and bring those to Africa as well? So I think China has a lot to give to the world in terms of expertise, and so we want to help further that with the Chinese government.
So what you have to do in China and what you are going to do in China will play a role in your global strategy of the foundation.
Sure. So when Bill was here in March, he signed an MOU with CPAD around poverty alleviation. I signed an MOU yesterday also with NHFPC, and it's around China's poverty alleviation goals. And so we are working specifically on primary health care in some of the most remote rural places here where these 40 million people still live in poverty, but particularly working on young children's nutrition. 10% of the population here is still stunted. And also working on that primary health care facility, that place that a mom or dad first takes their child for all the important things that they need, from vaccines to nutrition to other services. So we're going to work with the government on those pieces, and then as well work with China on their amazing R&D around all kinds of drugs and vaccines for global health around the world.
Wow, you have a lot of things to do in China. So let's talk back to the US. What do you think the populism now prevails in US and in part of Europe? Why do you think suddenly all of the institutions cannot convince the people? Yeah, they used to convince them.
Well, I think things have changed around the globe, and I think people need time to catch up with what has gone on around the world. You know, diseases are crossing border. People are leaving Africa and moving to Europe. And so I think you're seeing a restlessness among people about what's really going on with the technological change. And I think the most important message that we can give is that this foreign aid that has been given by the United States and by Europe and Japan, and now China's contributing a little bit to that as well. South Korea is a huge foreign aid donor partner now. That foreign aid helps develop economies like Africa, countries in Africa. And that if people have health and prosperity where they are and they can get a great job, they're going to stay there. And so if we want a peaceful and prosperous world, we need to invest in foreign aid. And so Bill and I now spend a lot of time advocating on behalf of foreign aid, not just to the US government, but also to European governments, to Japan, to South Korea, and even to China over time. Again, this amazing R&D that China has, exporting that on behalf of the world is going to benefit all of humankind.
So the Gates Foundation is quite unique around the globe. So how do you and Bill contribute to those uniqueness?
Well, I think it's the both the optimistic nature we have, we see where the world is going, and this ability, this belief that you have to constantly learn and constantly change, and that it's this belief in the innovations that have come and are coming along, and how do we apply those innovations in ways that can serve everyone, not just the high end of society, but absolutely everyone. So a perfect example is the mobile phone, right? There's still a pretty big gap between poor women in remote rural areas getting mobile phones. We need to make sure that mobile phones are ubiquitous and everybody gets them, because again, when a woman can get that money in her hands, if her husband gets a job and can send some yuan home, or she gets a few yuan that she's saving off of her farm, she then has her own account and her own money. And when you get money in the hands of women, it changes everything inside of her family.
True.
And so I think that's just one way that we try to take these innovations and make sure that they're spread equally for everybody.
I'm quite interested in the optimism you have. You always say that you are impatient optimism, but facing with a lot of world problems like the gap between the rich and poor, the terrorism, the slowing down of the world economy, a lot of people tend to be very pessimistic. But why so? Why are you so optimistic?
Well, I think sometimes we take the short-term crises and we highlight those on the news instead of looking at the long-term perspective. If you look at violence around the world, yes, there are some horrific places that are still violent in the world. But if you look at the long arc of history, the world is far less violent than it's ever been. If you look back and you say, since 1990, we've cut in half the number of children that die every year. We've cut it in half. Or you say in China, 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Yes, there are still 40 million to go, but 40 versus 700, that's a pretty phenomenal number. And so Bill and I look at that progress, and we're always asking ourselves, how do you take the lessons from that progress and how do you accelerate it on behalf of the world? And when I go out and visit families in these remote rural areas where they're not facing a disease that maybe somebody would have faced 20 years ago, or they're not getting as many episodes of malaria in their family, and they'll tell you the difference it makes, that makes me very optimistic about the world.
The Gates Foundation has achieved a lot of things, and is due to the partnership between you and Bill. A lot of people say that it's very hard for the couples to work under the same organization. So how do you manage to do that?
Yeah, well, sure, couples don't agree on everything, right? But I think that Bill and I have big goals that are shared goals, and we recommit ourselves to those big long-term goals. And we're both very ambitious about those goals. And so yes, we can disagree about some specifics sometimes, but what we always agree to do is to disagree in private, and then when we show up at the office, we are showed up as a unified couple. And as long as we have our sights on the long-term goals, it makes the small disagreements, to be honest, even smaller.
So you did have some major arguments?
We've certainly had disagreements, you bet. But they're always with the intent of, are we doing the most for the world? Are we doing the very best with these resources that we have from Microsoft and that Warren Buffett has given to our foundation? Are we doing the very best with those resources? And so the disagreements are more about how much do we spend on a particular project this year versus waiting for the long-term solution. And those are nuances, and they're important to work out though. But again, it's always with that long-term goal in mind.
First of all, I'd like to know how you became Melinda, today's Melinda. To choose a career in science is not many girls' choice. Did you inspired by anyone to choose computer science at Duke University?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all, Summer. And you know, I had a high school teacher who really inspired me. She was my math teacher in high school, and she was the first one to bring computers to our school. And she had a small group of girls who we volunteered to start programming, and I just got hooked. And she was a mom who was getting her own PhD at night, and she was single and raising 3 boys on her own. So she was a real inspiration to me that women could be good in math and computer science.
I heard that your father also is a very open towards girls to study science.
Absolutely. So my father worked on some of the early Apollo missions, the spacecraft missions.
So cool.
Yeah, and he always talked about at home the fact that his teams were better, his engineering teams, if he had a woman on them. And so the teams would reform every few years, and he would always try to attract some of the best female mathematicians or engineers to his team. So he completely thought that his 2 daughters, there were 2 girls in my family and then 2 boys, he thought the girls could equally be as good in the sciences as the boys could be.
Oh, it's a very good family environment, but what about the workplace? I heard that you were the only one MBA student who entered Microsoft. There are 10 MBA students at that time. What's your early experience working amongst your male co-workers?
Right, so in 1987, they had hired their first class of MBAs at Microsoft. There were 9 men and me. But you know, my experience was actually very positive. I had worked around a lot of men in computer science. It was mostly all young men in college coding. And I had had that experience already, so it wasn't that different, to be honest, when I went to Microsoft. And what I learned to hone at Microsoft were my management talents. And I realized again that I really believed in these collaborative teams that had males and females on them, and that it was all of us pulling together towards a joint goal that we could create the best software.
But what do you think about nowadays the environment in Silicon Valley? We all know that it seems not that equal, the male and female co-workers. So what do you think of that?
Yes, so when I was in computer science in the late 1980s, graduating from Duke University, women were on the rise in computer science, just like in law and in medicine. And today, if you look at the legal profession or the medical profession, we graduate in the United States about equally, men and women, from law or medicine. But computer science was on the rise, and then it went down like this. And I think there are a whole host of reasons for that. Starting all the way in grade school, we don't role model for girls that they can be good in computer science. We don't show them that they can be good coders just when they start to kind of lose their confidence. We know girls lose their confidence in middle school and gain it back in high school. So I think we have to do more at grade school, middle school, high school, college, and the tech sector needs to be more welcoming to women, because they have to look at the sector and say, that's too. And I think the technology jobs are some of the best jobs in society, so we need to fix this for young women.
Exactly, and there are studies showing that into girls and women have a great returns, but it's different from developed countries and developing countries. Do you have similar experience, and why do you think there's a gap there?
Well, I believe that we need to invest in women all over the world because women are the center of the family and they're the center of society. And so we know if you invest in a woman's education, she's going to also invest in her daughter's education. And when you educate a girl, you're educating everybody else, because she will start to lift her family out of poverty. We have great statistics about this all over the globe. And I think some of the reasons, though, we don't invest in women equally in some of the developing world nations is we don't actually have very good data. We don't go and really ask women and girls about their lives. And so we need to invest in better data so we actually know what investments to make on behalf of women and girls that will help them lift themselves and lift their whole families out of poverty.
And you spend a lot of time in Africa, so did you talk to those women and what did they tell you?
Yes, so I spend, I'm in Africa 2, 3, 4 times a year, and I talk to women often. So I not only do important government meetings and civil society meetings, but I go out into remote villages, I go into the slums very often to talk to women. And if you stay long enough, they will tell you about their lives. And one of the things women in Africa are asking us for are contraceptives. That is, tools that women use to space and limit the number of children that they have. And women will tell you over and over that if they can space the births of their children, they can stay in school, they can make sure they can feed their family, and they can get a great job. And so I heard this a lot on the ground in Africa, and then when I went back to look at the global statistics, turns out there are 200 million women asking us for contraceptives. And so I spend a lot of my voice and time and money these days advocating that women have access to contraceptives.
I agree with you that technology changed the world and changed women's lives. I once talked to a woman from India, and she told me that fintech changed her family because he can get a loan from the internet. So there are a lot of technology like internet, like mobile phones. What do you think is only one thing that has the most impact?
I think contraceptives have had the biggest impact. If you look at why women in the United States or Europe or Japan have been able to work, have been able to get a great education and go into the workforce, it's because they can space or limit the number of children they have. So I think that's been the biggest technology breakthrough. If you look back the last 40 years, I think the biggest breakthrough going forward is absolutely going to be the mobile phone, because a woman or a man can save a few yuan a day on their phone, and then they can buy things at the market, they can buy food, they can put their kids in school.
And earlier this year, I went to Seattle. I had a tour on Gates Foundation's museum. I love the museum. So what inspired you to establish the foundation in the first place in 2000 with Bill?
Well, it was really the first trip to Africa that Bill and I took. We took together, and we went really for a safari, which we had a lovely time and fell in love with the animals in the savannah, but it was really the people. We came back inspired by the people, and we started to ask ourselves some questions about why is it that people can grow up in a certain way in the United States or in China or in Europe, but they can't grow up that way in Africa. And what is it that a foundation could do about that to help people live a healthy and ultimately a prosperous and productive life? And it was that trip that started us on our journey.
So that's the trip, and that's from Africa. But now the foundation is quite global. So there are so many issues, challenges that need our attention. What makes you decide which to prioritize your foundation?
Well, we look at where the biggest, what we call death and disability happen in the world, and that's where we focus, because if you can start with a healthy life, you then have the chance to lift yourself out of poverty. You then can grow the right things, hopefully on your farm. With fintech, you can hopefully start to save a few yuan on your phone. But if you don't start with a healthy life, you can't go on to get a great education or to get a great job. So we look at the biggest diseases: HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and that's where we really focus the most. And but we focus globally because those issues, diseases cross borders. We know that today. They don't know any borders, and they also affect different people at different rates in different places.
And global health is one of your focus. It spent $32 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money. So that capital you pour into the global health and development has a great results. But I guess there might be some failures. So in the process, so how does these failures help you to make future decisions?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that's important to understand about philanthropy is that all philanthropy can do is be what we call a catalytic wedge. It can take pilot projects, it can take risks where sometimes a government can't or won't take a risk. It can shine light and move things forward. But everything we do at the foundation takes government money, huge government money to scale it up. Even what looks enormous, 32 billion, that's nothing if you want to really tackle HIV/AIDS around the world or malaria. But absolutely, we are willing to take risks, and so we get failures. So if you'd asked Bill or me 10 years ago, would we have an HIV/AIDS vaccine by now, we would have said yes, and we don't. But that failure on the HIV/AIDS vaccine made us realize that we shouldn't, as we were investing with others in these individual candidates, we had to learn from every single candidate that was invested in and have a whole pool in a database where all that research was poured into so we could learn from each of those failures, and all the scientists around the globe could learn from the various failures that happen. So we've learned to share a lot of data and information, whether we have a success or a failure, because that's how you move things forward.
Just now you mentioned about the government. I guess that the Gates Foundation must leverage other resources like the government, like other private sectors. Can you give us an example of how you leverage other resources to help you to push forward your agenda?
Sure, absolutely. Every single thing that we do is in partnership with civil society and the government. We don't have staff on the ground all over the world. So probably the best example I can give you is a public-private partnership that we helped start called the Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. It's a huge pool of money that's private and public, mostly public. And because of that pool of money, we can go to vaccine manufacturers and say, work on diseases of the poor world, where there wouldn't normally be a vaccine market there. There's this pool of money that can pull the vaccines through. They know, hey, there's actually funding for these vaccines. So then they'll work on an HIV/AIDS vaccine or a malaria vaccine where there was no incentive before. And so that's just one example of how government funding will ultimately, it does buy hundreds of millions of vaccines that vaccine fund has purchased. And now there are over 6 million children alive because of that partnership.
That's fabulous.